This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the best place to build a beautiful website.
Hey there everybody, and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. Today I'm very excited to deliver you this tutorial because I think it's going to provide a lot of value for a lot of people, specifically if you do biology animations, which I think the medical field is into. So here's the premise of this tutorial. I've seen even in high school when I was taking a biology class, the classic red blood cell in the blood vessel animation where you have this hemoglobin passing through. And all of these animations I looked at, some of them are good, but they're all kind of plain and there's no photorealism or visual interest. So I thought, let me remake this in my style and show you how I would do that. So, biology animation, here we go. So, take everything in Blender and delete it, and we are going to add in a curve. By the way, I'm using Blender version 3.5, so if you're missing some features, consider upgrading, which I say even though I haven't upgraded to 3.6. Either way, we're adding in this curve, and the reason I'm doing that, and I'm increasing the resolution, the reason we're doing that is this is going to be our blood vessel, and we're going to actually make this thing procedurally, and we're going to have red blood cells going through it. So, imagine this curve is our blood vessel. Go into geometry nodes, make this a geonodes group, and I'm going to call it vessel, where we are going to take this curve and actually convert it into a mesh that looks like a blood vessel. How do we do that? Well, if we use the curve to mesh operator, which is going to take a curve and output a mesh, you can imagine we use our curve. For a profile curve, I would recommend using a curve circle. We use these two curves, and boom. This is how we're going to make our blood vessel. The reason I'm doing this in geometry nodes, by the way, is so that it's procedural and so that I can draw the vessel as I go, in case I want it to turn in a certain direction or whatever. So I'm just going to kind of reposition this like that, and I'm not going to do much more of the blood vessel because I'm thinking we're just going to have a camera poking through here, and you can't, see around it. Okay? So there is our basic blood vessel, and let me just save this. I'm going to call it biology.blend. Okay, we have a blood vessel. Doesn't look good because it's a perfect tube. So let's distort it. The way I like to do this is I use a set position node because we want to change the position of the vertices, and we're going to do that randomly using a noise texture. So the noise texture is going to drive the randomness, and it's kind of going up and to the right by 0.5. So before, after. This is because noise texture adds a value between 0 and 1, so on average it's adding 0.5 to each axis, which means to correct for this, subtract by 0.5. So this is now randomized, but it's still centered. Looks horrible. How do we fix it? First of all, I want this to have more geometry, so I'm going to take the input curve, and I'm actually going to resample it to maybe 45 segments. So this is going to be 45 segments by 32 segments, the tube. And here's what the geometry looks like. So the denser it is, kind of the more we can do with this. But we're going to take that and scale down the noise, and then also scale down the influence of the noise. So I'm literally going to scale the vector, which is going to say, oh, how intense is this effect? So I'm going to take the noise even lower, so it's kind of lumpy, but not heavily distorted with ridges and all that. And I think that makes it look more like a blood vessel or a cave, whatever. If you think to yourself, oh, this doesn't look detailed enough, we're going to do that in the material. So maybe up the detail by 1, and I think we are done with that. And we're actually going to keep the geometry node since we're going to use it for the red blood cells. Okay, so we have our vessel. Before we continue, I just want to set up my scene so I know what we're working with. I'm going to add a camera, and for that camera, we're going to do camera to view, just so we can make a bit of composition, because I don't know what materials or geometry or whatever I want until I do that. Now, because a blood vessel is very small, if you were to somehow stick a camera in there, what you would imagine is that you need a giant or a very small focal length or a giant field of view. So I'm going to kind of mimic these things to make it look better. So I'm going to take the focal length, and instead of 50, let's make it 20, if not more. But now you can see this is looking a bit longer in a sense. We could even make that more extreme, like 15. And I'm going to actually make another view, just so we can see what this looks like in the camera view, and then position the curve otherwise. Okay, so we have our camera. What I'm saying is we're going to take our curve and just kind of extend it, so you can see it's kind of taking up the camera view. And I think that already looks pretty good. Last thing with the composition here is I kind of want to move this further back and rotate it a bit more so you really can't see around the corner. You could also have it kind of go into the third dimension by having it go down a little. Okay, happy with that. For the camera now, I'm going to go to viewport display and increase this passepartout, which is going to have us only see our scene. Okay, it's looking pretty good, except in rendered mode, it just looks gray. Why is this the case? Because no light is coming in here. So before we do materials, we need to add a light source. And you can see once we add a light source, it kind of turns into a cave. There are two approaches to this. You could either add a light source and then make the material, or the material could be the light source. And that's actually what I'm going to do. But do it at your discretion. We're doing a biology animation. We're not actually sticking a camera down there. It's up to us. Okay. So we're going to make a material. I'm going to call it vessel. And by the way, anything we do to this material won't apply because in geometry nodes, you need to explicitly apply the material. So now we have the vessel material. I go to shading, and you're going to see, even though it's gray, the color is now changing. To make this thing work for us and actually emit light, I'm going to first of all make this a cycles render, which is already going to give us a bit of shading just because the light is doing global illumination. But I think what we can do is we can do better. So what I'm thinking is if we take the emission and kind of make it brighter and obviously red, you can see it's actually adding light to the scene. But I don't want to do that everywhere because then it's kind of a wash. So we're actually going to take the Fresnel, which you can see kind of gives us like ridges, especially if we bring this down. You can really see how it's kind of shaping our cave or vessel. We're going to use the Fresnel to basically say where it should be illuminated. And again, the reason we added ridges and geometry nodes is one, it looks better, but two, we can now exploit the Fresnel. So I'm going to connect this to emission strength, and now when we view this, you can see it's only emitting light in those areas. Specifically, I wanted to emit a bright red light. And again, you can play with this to tell it how much to do this with. Okay, that's looking pretty good. To make it a bit stronger, just multiply. So I'm going to multiply by 2. So here's the before and the after. So I think it's already looking pretty good. We're going to do things to make it better. And then we're going to handle red blood cells, etc. So this is already looking pretty good, but from a biological perspective, these vessels are made of cells, and I don't actually know the biology. It should look a bit bumpier, is what I'm thinking. So let's add that in. I'm going to add a noise texture, or we could do a Voronoi texture. You know what? I'm going to do a Voronoi texture. This actually was not the plan in my head, but I'm going to go for it. So Voronoi texture is going to give us this kind of cellular kind of look. Before we do anything with this, make sure we're setting this to object coordinates. This is going to make sure everything's uniform. And as we bring down the scale, you can see it kind of makes these kind of cell-like things, which is perfect because I'm saying that this vessel is made of cells, so why not make a cellular map? What I'm thinking is we can take this Voronoi texture and literally create normals out of it. So this is going to be the bump, and the bump goes into the normal, so I'm converting Voronoi information, float information into normal, and now, doesn't look great, but we're working on it. You can see this has a lot more character. One issue with this is you can see there's these harsh dividing lines, which I do not like. So let's fix that. Instead of F1, let's make it smooth F1. If you don't know what that means, here's a visual. This is F1. You can kind of see there's these boundaries. And then with smooth F1, we kind of have a control of how much these blend together. This may or may not be good enough for us. By the way, since we're basically altering the normals, and our Fresnel can be based off normals, what I would recommend, take this, connect it here. It looks insane. Let's tone that down. But the idea of this is now it's also going to use these additional normals to say, hey, put Fresnel in these areas. So I'm going to mix our normals with the original normals. So this texture coordinates normal is what it was using before, but now we're mixing some bump into it. And just for simplicity, I'm going to add a normal here as well, even though it accepts it by default. So when I plug this in here, we can now see that we can go between the bad one, the okay one, and what we care about is something somewhere in between. Okay, so I paused this tutorial to tell you about the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. They've been sponsoring for a very long time, so I appreciate it. And if you don't know what Squarespace is, it is the best and the most beautiful way to make a website. In fact, my website, www.cgmatter.com, is made with Squarespace because you don't need to know any coding. You just drag around blocks or squares, and that is how you make your website. So here are 3 features you probably want to know about Squarespace before or after trying it. The first one is you get access to analytics, so you know who is going to your website, demographic type information. Of course, that's important. Second of all, and I think this is newly added, they added the asset library, which is basically a place in Squarespace where you have all your images, videos, audio, whatever, that you've ever uploaded to your website. So you can think of this as an archive of all the assets, which wasn't the case before, I don't think. This is useful because now I can go back to an asset that I uploaded like in 2019, a long time ago, and it's still there. And the third feature, which I think is the most obvious one, because that is the point of Squarespace, is again, the way you design the website. It's just so like intuitive, right? You have a template, you drag around squares, you don't need to know coding or anything like this. So head over to Squarespace and try out making a website for whatever project or business or whatever it is that you want to make. And when you are ready to take that website live, you can use my link in the description to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now, back to the tutorial. Okay, so this is without, this is with. It just adds a bit of character. And if anything, I want these cells to be smaller. There we go. Okay, so without, with. It's just going to add a bit of character to our thing instead of it being perfectly smooth. Other things to consider, you can play around with all of these like settings and like even play around with the kind of distance function it's using. I actually kind of like the look of this, but that's up to you. Final thing for this normal is I'm going to take the strength, bring it down so it's not as intense, and I think I'm now happy with this blood vessel. Okay, that is done. And because of how we created this thing, just a reminder, it's completely procedural, and the lighting, this Fresnel lighting, will work no matter what. Okay? So we have that, and you're probably thinking, okay, next step is add the red blood cells. I don't think so. I think we can do a bit better. One thing I realized as I was testing with this, as you can see, this is our render. By the way, fans going off. It's a large render. You're going to hear some fan in the background. You're going to notice that as we look at this, it's okay, but it doesn't really have a sense of depth. I don't know how far into it I'm looking. A solution for this is if we look at the render passes, if we were to look at the mist pass, which I believe we need to enable to see it, you can barely see it over here. Or let me add overlays. You can barely see it over here. This is basically going to give us a sense of depth, but it's not really doing a good job. So here's how we fix that. So again, mist pass is a way to kind of get perspective or depth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the camera settings, and in viewport display, I'm going to enable mist. The way you want to think about this, you're going to see this line. This is going to be the beginning of the mist, or depth equal to 0. And this is going to be the end of the mist, or depth is equal to 1. We want to make sure the span is basically inside our vessel. What do I mean by this? I mean, if we go into our world settings and go to our mist settings, I'm going to bring the start of it just to the camera. Basically right here. Oh, I didn't know that the overlays were kind of 3D. That's cool. We're going to have the start be there, and we're going to have the end be much closer. And you can see over here on the mist pass, we can see what this looks like. So basically what I'm thinking is instead of like adding volumetrics or something like that, I'm going to use this mist pass to basically get free depth that looks correct. Okay? So adjust your mist settings. You can have it be linear. You can have it be quadratic, inverse quadratic. I'm happy with this. And to actually see what this looks like incorporated, we're going to need to do a bit of compositing. So we're going to do a bit of work before we add the red blood cells and stuff like this. Okay. So what is the plan? The plan is let's make a render and apply the mist pass. So this is in compositing, which is why I'm doing a render. So I'm going to render at 200 samples, make sure mist is enabled, and let's see what this looks like. When we render this, we're going to get the combined image, of course, kind of like the render pass. And we're going to get a mist pass that we'll be able to work with. I didn't expect it to take this long. Are we using CPU instead of GPU? This would be a mistake. Oh, we are using GPU. Oh well. We're rendering. I'll skip to when it's done. Okay, so our render is done, and what I want to do with this is I want to incorporate that mist pass that I was talking about. So to do that, we can just go into compositing, make sure we have use nodes available or enabled. And this is what our render looks like. But remember, what we care about is this additional, I went by it, mist pass. I guess you could say I missed it. Okay, what we want to do is we want to incorporate that with our render. And you might think this is complicated, but it really isn't. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mix our render with some color, in this case it's white, with a factor of the mist. And you can see the moment we do that, the way it's going to look is it's going to be our original render with almost like a fog or something like that. But if I change this fog to be kind of like an orangish, reddish kind of look, all of the sudden we get a nice sense of depth. And if you wanted to further control this, you can use a color ramp. And you can see now we're basically controlling how deep the fog goes into here. And you could do it the other way too. So the reason I'm doing this, even though it's probably not that intense, is it really gives us a sense of depth, and it's going to look like the hemoglobin's really wrapping around. I'm just going to decrease the intensity of that a bit. Okay, so that is what our render is going to look like every time when we enable the mist pass, and we're not going to see that in the viewport. And another trick, by the way, to make this look better and more realistic, whatever that means, is in our camera, I'm going to enable depth of field. The reason for this, as you can imagine, again, we're taking a very, very tiny camera and sticking it into a blood vessel, so the field of view should be wide, and the depth of field should be very narrow, I'm imagining. So to do this, you bring the f-stop way down to something like 0.1, and I'm going to change the distance so it's like right in front of us. In fact, so we just want to kind of get it in focus. In fact, probably the easiest way to do this is I'm just going to add an empty, and this is going to be our focal point where our thing is going to be in focus. And what we can say is have this be the focus object. So you can see now this is perfectly in focus. Let me make this a little less intense. And you can see this is what it looks like with